Yeah, so I do have to speculate. I would suspect it's in part due to a greater consumption of fructose. There are some nutrients that are metabolized, let's say poorly, if you will, that lead to altered fat storage. So there was a study done in humans, males and females, that gave them isocaloric drinks of high glucose or high fructose. Both gained some degree of fat during the course of the study, but where they gained the fat was totally different. The high glucose drinkers gained relatively more subcutaneous fat, so the pinchable, jiggable fat, which generally predominates on the female body, whereas the fructose drinking population had more visceral adipose. So at a minimum, I suspect part of it could be the effect of how the liver in particular is metabolizing fructose and then dumping that fructose turned into fat into that kind of portal circulation, which is going to feed through visceral adipocytes first. So like even still, that's speculative, but we know for a fact in humans, all calories equal. Well, they're not, but fructose consumption will selectively promote greater visceral adipose storage. And of course, fructose, that's not only, like from fruit juice, but even sugar, of course.
Yeah.
Any enriched source of fructose would have the potential to contribute to that.
Is there sort of an upper threshold of fructose, or is it really genetically dependent? Like, I mean, can some people, since fructose isn't really involved in glycogen resynthesis of the muscle or anything like that, like you can't necessarily exercise your way out of that in a lot of ways. Yet, you've got people that are athletes that consume a fair bit of fructose, yet they still have good cardiometabolic parameters and good biomarkers, and they don't have. So is it somewhat bio-individual? Is there a rough number where, hey, like, because I know like if you're eating just fruit, it's kind of hard to reach a ridiculous amount of fructose.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So that's a great question. And I don't really have my finger on the pulse of that research enough, but I'll speculate because I'm a professor and I'm used to speculating. In this case, I would say that it's interesting to me to note people who have become advocates of consuming high fructose sources, they're always lean and healthy. I would be interested to see someone who advocates a lot of fructose consumption who is overweight and diabetic. And so I don't know that there is an inherent genetic ability to tolerate fructose a little better, although there certainly could be. We know that there are certain groups of people who metabolize alcohol better. And why would I even invoke alcohol? The one similarity between fructose and alcohol is that they both primarily rely on the liver for their metabolism. So just as we know there are people who are able to more rapidly metabolize alcohol, it wouldn't surprise me if there are people who can more rapidly metabolize and tolerate fructose. But even still, I do think it's important to control the dose. That whole fruit, for me, one of the first cardinal rules of eating a diet to improve insulin sensitivity is control carbs. And when I invoke that mantra, it really is to help people understand the value of whole fruits and vegetables, not juiced fruits and vegetables. And I think to me, that's the divider. If this is a population or a person who's eating whole fruit, then I generally would give that a thumbs up, depending on where they're coming from. If this is an overweight, severely type 2 diabetic, there may be some fruits that would be a little more problematic than others, but any would be better than drinking the fruit.
So the link that I put down below is for my favorite probiotic called Seed. It is a synbiotic. So it has a prebiotic and a probiotic. So a capsule inside of a capsule, really fascinating tech. And it's the only probiotic I'll use because most of them, quite frankly, are garbage. This is something that you can start taking and start feeling almost immediately. When I started taking it about 5 years ago, it was a game changer for me. It helped my sleep. It helped my appetite. I had weird cravings before that I didn't realize were being driven probably by my gut biome. Bottom line is, give it a shot. I highly recommend it.
Yeah. I want to bounce back just before I forget. 2 questions on the insulin piece with sort of suppressing lipolysis. Is it a dimmer switch more so than a light switch? And if it is a dimmer switch, does it, as you start to crank it up or down, does it gain more momentum as you're cranking it up to 11? If you have an insulin release and its ability to allow fat into a young or a new fat or a small fat cell, when you have a little bit of insulin, is there a little bit of momentum, and does it increase? Does it kind of gain momentum with more?
Yeah, that's a good question. So to answer the first part of the question very definitively, it is absolutely a dimmer. It is completely a function of degrees, and you can titrate this beautifully in like living breathing humans, you can monitor this over time, where the product of lipolysis, so when we're talking about breaking down the fat from the fat cell, the stored form of the fat in the fat cell is triglycerides. The product of the lipolysis is free fatty acids, sometimes referred to as non-esterified fatty acids, but free fatty acids. And you can get this measured on a blood test, albeit it's not uncommonly. However, my point about the kind of titrating or the changing the dose, if insulin skyrockets, give that body a few minutes, and if you're measuring free fatty acids, the free fatty acids plummet and go to almost undetectable very, very quickly. In contrast, the more you give the body time to allow the insulin to come down, and the fastest way to do that, of course, is fasting. So if a fast starts from this point of really high insulin and essentially no lipolysis, so free fatty acids basically baseline, and then the more time you're giving them, you can see this beautiful crossover. In Dr. George Cahill, a legend in the field of fasting, or what he called starvation research, we would call it fasting, he really has published some beautiful papers that show these kinds of figures, where when insulin would start to get to around 10 microunits per mil, you could immediately start to see this reduction. So the insulin's coming up, you'd start to see this reduction in the free fatty acids. But then back to the paradigm I'd outlined a moment ago, if you take a fed individual and start fasting them, as insulin starts coming down, you can see this steady decline hour after hour of the free fatty acids coming up. But that's right there, if you'll allow me, Thomas, there's an interesting test that someone can do at home. So I've presented the viewpoint that the first cell or tissue that becomes insulin resistant is the fat cell. And I defend that vigorously. Because of this, you can actually combine the two variables that I just mentioned into what I consider to be one of the best tests for detecting insulin resistance at the earliest possible stage. In other words, the moment it's starting at the fat cells. So as we go back to that hypertrophic fat cell, as it starts to become insulin resistant, insulin levels are high. There's no such thing as insulin resistance without elevated insulin. You cannot pull those two apart. If it's insulin resistance, insulin levels are high. Well, with what I just mentioned, if insulin levels are high, we would expect free fatty acids to be low, unless the fat cells have become hypertrophic and now they're insulin resistant. Now we have this metabolic oddity where both insulin is elevated and free fatty acids are elevated. This is a particularly pathogenic state because while the fat cells are full and they can't handle anymore, if insulin is up, you can't burn that fat. Normally, you only have high free fatty acids when insulin is low, and because insulin is low, you can now burn it. Beta oxidation, or the burning of the fat, is just going like gangbusters. So much so that you're burning more than you need and you start making ketones, which is a different topic. But if you have both high insulin and high free fatty acids, now you start storing those free fatty acids in tissues that are ill-suited for long-term fat storage. This is this idea of ectopic fat deposition, where now you're storing fat in your muscles, in your pancreas, in your liver. So you have all of these fatty deposits in tissues that are not designed to store fat, but it's because when you have high insulin and high free fatty acids, you can't burn that fat. You have to store it. It's just you can't store it in the fat tissue anymore.
Does the same thing apply with high amounts of co-ingestion of fats and carbs together at the same time, or do we have a way to partition?
No, that's a great question. If you have a lot of fat and carb together, that is a particularly fattening mix because you have both of the two components. So first of all, you would burn glucose as the primary fuel in that state because insulin dictates fuel use. In fact, on my little YouTube channel, I just finished a lecture about the Randall cycle or the glucose fatty acid cycle and described how it really is at its heart a manifestation of insulin. If insulin is low, the body is sugar burning or glucose burning. If insulin's high, sugar burning. If insulin's low, fat burning. If you've spiked insulin because of the glucose consumption, and you've won with the high insulin, you have signaled the fat cell that it's time to grow. But that alone is insufficient. If I took you and injected a dose of insulin in you, that would, yes, stimulate fat cell growth by pulling in glucose and inhibiting free fatty acid release, and you would faint because there would be insufficient other nutrients in your blood. So I wouldn't have stimulated your fat cells to grow at all because there's no fuel for that growth. So I'm touching on a deeper debate now.
Oh, this is great.
Which is why do we get fat and how do we lose it? But people, as much as we want to go into separate camps, and people say, no, it's purely calories. We know that's not true. That is so easy to disprove that it's almost laughable that that idea still has any credence. Because if we took a type 1 diabetic, our good friend and Dr. Andrew Kutnick, if we took Andrew and had him eat 10,000 calories a day but deprived him of his insulin injection, he would look like a prisoner of war. He would be so skinny, even though he's clearly eating an abundance of calories. If you don't have insulin in an organism, from fruit flies to humans, it is utterly and completely impossible to store fat. So thus, insulin is an absolutely essential component to fat storage. But so are calories, because insulin alone isn't sufficient. We need insulin to tell the fat cell what to do with the energy that it has available to it. But we need the energy to actually fuel that growth. So insulin's going to tell the fat cells it's time to grow. But now the fat cell says to insulin, okay, but with what? Now the calories come in. So neither is sufficient on its own. And so this whole vicious debate, and it does get unfortunately vicious. I try to actually take a diplomatic route, but people end up putting me into this endocrine theory of obesity camp, or the insulin theory, because of what I just said. And I'll say it again with an exclamation mark. You cannot store fat on a body unless insulin is elevated. It is totally impossible. And again, if insulin is absent or really low at low fasted levels, you can't keep that fat on the body. But again, as much as insulin is a necessary component to signal the growth of the fat cell, you have to have sufficient energy to fuel that growth. And that's where the calories, of course, come in, although I kind of changed the topic.